Aloha and welcome to this practice WOD called Experience Testing Position of the Element. That's kind of a crazy name. But what we're going to do is go back to an older practice WOD called the Position of the Element, where you wrote this single function position and check to make sure that it would, given certain values, return certain values. We're going to go back and write tests for that code as a way of getting familiar with the use of Jasmine. And before you start this WOD, of course, you should have finished E28. If you don't have that code around and committed to GitHub, you need to go ahead and take the time now to actually finish that experience, because we're going to build off it directly. And the other thing is to study all the readings for this test module. In particular, I highly recommend you take that Udacity course on JavaScript testing with Jasmine. It takes, really less than an hour, 45 minutes maybe, to go through it. And it's a really well done introduction. I can't do any better than that, so I just suggest you use them instead of me to learn basics of Jasmine. Of course, you're now using me to learn the way that we'll integrate it into the material for this class. Okay, so let's start the WOD, which means I got to go here, start your timer, and I'm supposed to start by creating a branch of my position repo called testing1. All my work for the WOD will be done in this branch, and this is a general strategy we're going to be using for really the rest of the semester, where we'll start with the master branch. We're going to do all our WODs off of the master branch, and then this gives us a really easy way to repeat WODs, because now I can just revert to master and it'll be right at the place where I was right before I started the WOD. And also, when we get done with, you kind of take your best version of a particular WOD and you can merge it back into master, and then we can build off that. Okay, so I created that branch called testing1. The next thing we're going to do is remove the Intellij files from GitHub. We hadn't done coding standards before we did this WOD, so this is actually a good moment to kind of see what's the process that we would use to upgrade a repo which has accidentally committed some files, to get those files out of it. And so we're going to add the standard.gitignore, and I'm going to do it this way. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I'm going to just save it in that directory, and then I'm going to go to the Finder, and I'm going to say that I actually need to rename this to .gitignore, and then it'll say, do I want to use a name that begins with dot? Yes, I do. Do we want to remove the extension .txt? Yes, I do. If you are using a Mac, you got to make sure that your Finder is showing you the extensions under Finder Preferences, Advanced. You can click this Show All File Name Extensions if you don't know how to do that, but that's kind of important for understanding what the heck is going on. Okay, so that's I've added the standard.gitignore file. Delete the Intellij project files locally. So I'll go back here, and there's two things. I got to delete that .idea, and I've got to delete that .iml, star.iml. Okay, I've done that, and commit and sync these changes. So now I go back to my position repo, and I say delete Intellij project files. Okay, so that's all done. And I'm actually, I'm not only just committing it to my local repo, but I'm syncing it with GitHub. So in general, in this class, you'll see me almost always do a commit and sync. So I'm always just kind of keeping my GitHub repo and my local repo in sync with each other. Git allows you to do things differently than that, but I find that for the purposes of this course, we don't really need to deviate. Now we need to recreate the project with Intellij, because we got rid of those project files. And the reason why I did it this way is because recreating the project is so simple. So we'll say create new project, static web, go find position, which is right here, choose, finish, and voila. Okay, so now the good news is, if we look in GitHub, we'll see that even though we've created those files again, so .id is back, position.iml is back, but you'll notice there's nothing to commit. That's because it's now being ignored, you know, in the .gitignore, and so we're not going to commit them. So they're ignored by Git, which is what we want. Okay, so the next thing is to add the Standard Jsn Rc file. So we'll go through kind of the same thing. I'll do a save as, put it into position, and go to the Finder, and then Philip Johnson, position, we'll select this, hit return, and then rename it to .jshint rc. Okay, so that's something, and OK, and OK. So now we've got this JSHint RC file, and that's the standard. In the last module, I wasn't always doing this, but I want to be clear from now on that we'll always have a .jshint RC file. We'll commit it into the project of interest, because you may be making minor modifications to this JSHint configuration file from project to project, and it's convenient to have one, and you can share it amongst team members. There's no problems with that. Plus, if you go to a kind of a continuous integration or automated testing, automated quality assurance, you can have tools that actually run JSHint over your repo every time you commit it, for example, and by having the .jshint RC file in the project, you know, it can find the test that you actually want to make against it. Okay, so all that's a long way of saying okay, so then we enable JSHint on the project. So that involves going to Preferences, Languages and Tools, JavaScript, Code Quality Tools, JSHint, Enable, Use Config Files. We're going to use the default mode, which is use the .jshint rc file when it can find it. Click OK. And now if we go to position.js, and run our inspect code, okay, what we'll find is no errors. Okay, which was surprising me for a second until I realized, yeah, there are no errors. One of the reasons is because the functions, we have this console.log, which is actually doing all our tests. So if I comment out these sections, okay, what we'll find is that we have some JSHint errors now, which is that position is defined but never used, and also test vars is defined and never used. So we in general don't want to have these console.log statements in our code anymore. That's, you know, you don't want to print that out every time, and in fact those were being used before as an informal way of testing. Now we're going to a formal way of testing, and so we won't have those console.logs, which means we will have this position error. And you know, the way that you want to get rid of that in JSHint mode is to add this exported global declaration, which says position is going to be used someplace else, and so you know, I'm telling JSHint to not worry about the fact that it's declared but not used. We still have this test nums thing here. I'm going to leave it there. Well, what the heck? I mean, we might as well get rid of it for a second, just so we can see how to do that. So there it goes away. But it's going to turn out that we're going to get rid of this variable anyway once we add the test. But just to satisfy the instructions, we fixed all the JSHint violations, which is a good thing to do. Next thing is to add JS.comments, and I'll just add this one. So we'll say finds the position in the array of nums where num should be inserted. Nums, the array of numbers, the number to be inserted, the position where it should be inserted. Okay, so that's our JS hint for that function. And then we have to download the Jasmine 2.3.4 standalone distribution. So if we click this link, we go here. This is the thing we want to click on to download the standard distribution. But it actually turns out that if I look in my downloads, you can see that I have it right here. Okay. So I have downloaded that. And let me now ask what it was I was supposed to do. So I copy the lib and spec directories and specrunner.html file into our project. Okay, so let's, so we got the lib, we got the spec, and we got specrunner.html. So I'll do a propeller C to copy, and then I'll go to position, and then I'll click that, and I'll say replace. I'm not sure why that was already there, but might have been a holdover from a previous. I'm not sure. But anyway, so I've copied those in, and the next thing it wants me to do is delete spec helper. So we'll get rid of that and rename player spec to position spec. And you'll see in a second why I'm doing this. Basically, I want to use their code. I don't want to start from scratch, but I want it to be named correctly when that's all done. So anyway, so now I've got those files in there. Let's go back to my Intellij, and if we're following along, we want to edit specrunner.html to load position.js and positionspec.js. So if I go back to Intellij, what we'll see if we look at specrunner is that it's loading source files from the sample distribution, which we don't have anymore, and it's also using this spec helper. So instead of source.player.js, what we want to do is load position.js, song.js, we don't want to use anymore, and then spec helper, that one's done, and then player. See, look at Intellij, it's telling you that file I can't find. So let's tell it to look for positionspec.js. Okay, and when it finds that, so now we load all our Jasmine files, and then we load our source files, and then we load our spec file, and we're all kind of ready to go. Let's go back here. So now we want to convert the 4 sample calls in E28 into Jasmine test. So if I go back to Intellij and I look at position.js, here's actually our calls. But I need to know the return value. So actually what I'm going to do is go to Google Chrome and look at the position of the element. Because in fact, I didn't even say in that code what it should. So when I call this with 5, so we call it with our test nums and 5, and it should return 2. So how do we do that as a test? Okay, well the first thing we want to do is we actually want these test values. And so let's go over to specrunner. No, let's not go. I'm sorry. Let's go into our spec, position spec. Okay, and we're going to declare at top level our test nums. Okay, and then we want to say position. Okay, and then when passed, let's remember what it is. Position when past 5 should return 2. So position when past 5 should return 2. And so we'll go get rid of this, and so we'll say position expect position when we pass it test nums and 5 to equal 2. Okay, so having done that, so there's our very first test case. So let's now clean things up. So we now got to get rid of that because that doesn't mean anything, and but the before each doesn't mean anything. It's just sample code that shows how Jasmine works, and then all the rest of this stuff doesn't mean anything to us. Really, all we care about is declaring, saying position, declaring test nums, and then calling position with this test num value and seeing what happens. Okay, so let's now go back to spec runner. Okay, and then we'll do an option F2, invoke it in Chrome, and here's what we get. We get that we passed, that by this green bar, that means we passed, and we see position when passed 5 should return 2. So everything's super good. So let's see what our other ones are when we pass it 2, 2, 1, 7, 4, and 0, 0. So let's go back to Intellij, and let's go back into our position spec. Okay, and so what we want to basically do is copy this. Oops. We want to copy this, and then got 4 total. So let me remind ourselves one more time. 2, 1, 7, 4, 0, 0. So 2, 1, 7, 4, 0, 0. And then 5, 2. So 2, 1, 7, 4, 0, 0. Okay, so let's go back to spec runner and let's try running that and see what happens now. And now we see that all 4 of our test cases pass, which is awesome. And in fact, it might be kind of interesting to just see what happens when we make when it's not right. So let's just see what happens, you know, when we've got a failing test case, just to prove ourselves that things are different. And here's what happens. So things turn out to be red now, and we can see that there were 3 passing test cases and then 1 that failed, and it says position when passed 0 should return 0. Wait a second, I wanted it to return 0, but it actually equaled 1. Okay, so let's go back here and actually fix that, because you know we want our test cases to pass. Okay, so we're now let's see what we have here. We've got some JSN position is not defined. Okay, well it's actually being imported. So what we want to do now is let's run our, well, let me go back and follow the instructions. Okay. So we go back to here. So run JSN again. Note the new errors are discovered because JSN is running over all of the library code, and we want to create a custom scope that can only run JSN on position.js and position.spec.js. Okay, so let's go back to IntelliJ IDEA, and we'll run inspect code over the whole project, and we get oh wait, it's still going. Okay, so now we get 391 problems, which is, you know, quite a lot of problems. And part of the reason is because it's looking through the whole project. So how do we fix that? The way we can fix it is if we go into inspect code, instead of saying whole project, we're going to define a custom scope. And to do that, we go to this little thing, we say plus, we're going to define a new scope, call it a local scope, we'll call this position. And then we're going to say the files that we want to test, there's only 2 files we really want to test, position.js include, and in our spec directory, position.spec.js. We'll include that. So now there's only 2 files we're going to, and this is, you know, in general going to be, you know, each program that you write, you're going to have to think for yourself how it is actually that you want to do these tests. Okay, and so now we notice that we get this error that from JSHint that it's expecting position, so we can fix that by saying declaring up positions, declaring position as global. Now our JSHint passes, and let's see where we are now. We removed all our errors. When the test passed in JSN without problems, commit your branch to GitHub. Let's just one more time go here, because I noticed that Jasmine's still red. That's a little bothersome. Okay, so we've got everything's passing, and which means we're now ready to go to GitHub, and we're going to say added Jasmine tests, commit and sync, and we see it sync. Okay, everything's done. We can even go to GitHub from here. And here we have our master branch, which has, IntellJ files committed. But if we go to test 1, we see that we no longer have the IntellJ files, but we do have our git ignore, and we've got our Jasmine files all in there. Okay, there's other things that we could be doing, like I'm not having you update the README file for this particular exercise, just so we can focus on the testing aspect of things. Okay, so stop your timer, 19:20, 19:30. I'll call this 20 minutes, just for to round, and that's a little bit of a long time for this stuff. But we were doing some other things as well that you won't have to do in future, like updating GitHub to add a git ignore and all that stuff. So in general, once you get the testing set up, the cost now of adding an incremental test is very small, and we can run these tests automatically. All sorts of good things are going to be coming to us as a result of adding testing to our code. So I hope you enjoyed this.